Welcome to 1 Million Cups Peoria. I don't think anybody's here for the first time. I could be wrong. Is anyone here for the first time? You are?
All
okay.
right.
I think I've just met you before somewhere. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. We are an educational, do you want me to do the whole rundown? Where's Randon? I don't even know. We're an educational event that happens every week here at 1 Million Cups Peoria. We are meeting at the Art Guild, of course, and someone will get up and present. This week we have Joe Chicolo from Bit AML.
Yes.
Is that how you pronounce it? Okay,
Correct.
so he's going to tell us a little bit more about Bitcoin. So that's going to be really interesting because if you're like me, you probably don't know a lot about Bitcoin, but it's something that's up and coming and not very present in the area. Is sponsored this week by IdeaBox. IdeaBox helps organizations create consistent branding through graphic design, video production, website development, event coordination, and online marketing. Their team combines art and technology with a passion to think differently. And we have Mike Heine here this week from IdeaBox, representing them. Announcements. We have Key Start coming up in July. Startup Peoria did not do Key Start in June, so July is open. There's a $5,000 investment on the table, so that could go to any one of you. So please apply for that. You can go on to Startup Peoria's website and apply for that. Or if you don't want to apply, just come to the event because it's really awesome. I think I got everything, so I will hand it over to Joe.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right. Love the enthusiasm, the excitement. Tell you what, I'm excited to be here for two reasons this morning. The first is, of course, to present my business, Bit AML, but more importantly, to talk to you a little bit about Bitcoin, digital currency, what's all this disruption and innovation going on. Before I do that, a lot of people ask what my story is, right? So Colleen mentioned, we're not really in the tech center of the world here in central Illinois. Why is Joe into Bitcoin? So I guess I'll rewind a little bit. For the past 10 years or so, I've been a compliance professional within traditional banking, what my clients refer to as legacy banking, because they think it'll be a thing of the past. But in that time, I've had a lot of accomplishments, a lot of opportunities, met and worked with a lot of smart and intelligent people. There was one thing missing, though. Financial services, believe it or not, is not a laboratory for innovation. They don't necessarily embrace entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial ideas, because to me, entrepreneurialism is having an idea. It's solving problems, right? Problem, solution. It's not necessarily starting businesses, although that's the most common iteration. To me, it's a mindset, and that was what one piece missing. Fast forward a little bit, or rather rewind a little bit, to 2013, and I discovered Bitcoin. Regulators came out and said, we're going to regulate this as part of the financial system. So I thought, what is Bitcoin? So I started, like any good investigator, I started out reading about it, familiarizing myself, YouTube, Google. What I found was nothing short of amazing, and I hope you'll agree with me today. So that brings us to the obvious question. Well, what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is many things. Perhaps the most obvious, or what people start off by saying, is it's a digital currency, right? It's a digital store of value. Makes sense. Now, this could be a little scary to people, right? Oh, it's internet money. It's not real money. But when you step back and think about it, statistically, only 8% of the money in circulation around the world is actually in physical form. So what we might think of as the $1 bill, for example, or quarters in our pocket. So then, 92% of it must be in some electronic means. So a little bit of a comfort zone right there, right off the bat. Also, digital currency has a lot of the hallmarks of traditional currency. It's portable, it's durable, it's divisible, so up to 8 decimal points. So much like a gold brick, we don't all go out and invest in gold bricks, we buy fractions. And we'll talk a little bit more about Bitcoin as we move forward. So what else is Bitcoin? It's a decentralized payment network. Clue in on that word, decentralized. I think we're all thinking about that, right? Uber. So think of Bitcoin as sort of the Uber of financial services. Wholly decentralized, smaller units performing intricate activities that are interrelated. Great. It's also a public ledger of transactions. So Bitcoin takes place on what's called the blockchain. The blockchain is a public ledger of every single transaction going back to the first issuance of Bitcoin. Banking right now does not have that. You have tens of thousands of private ledgers at each individual bank. What the public ledger lets you do is you can actually download it, not right now because I'm presenting, but after this presentation you can actually go home and download the blockchain and you can see every single transaction going back and forth. Pretty cool. Talk about transparency. And finally, it's the purest form of peer-to-peer banking. There's no central authority in the middle, there's no clearinghouse, there's no bank. It actually brings you and connects you with the other individual or business that you're transacting with. Pretty cool. What's all that mean? Well, that means disruption. And not disruption for disruption's sake. Obviously, there's some political and social overtones to Bitcoin, and that's fine. But we get some intrinsic benefits. 0 transaction fees. How many people accept credit cards as part of their business? Credit cards, debit cards? Show of hands. Great, so you guys are all familiar with the transaction fees, right? 2.7%, 2.9%. Absolutely nothing to transact Bitcoin. Free. You're probably familiar with chargebacks, right? So someone comes in, they steal someone's identity, and they come in and buy product or service from you, a couple $100. They leave the store. Somebody comes back and says, hey, this wasn't me. My ID was ripped off. The bank investigates. They refund your money. Well, that's great for you, but now they go knocking on the door of the business, and they say, you owe us that money. So no chargebacks. All transactions are final with Bitcoin. There's no third-party holding of data. So do you guys remember the Target data breach? Right? All that information. Why does Target have all that information? Why do they have Social Security number? I bet if you asked them, they'd say, we don't want to be responsible for your Social Security number. Who would want that task? Well, that's because of a 1950s invention known as the credit card. And on that credit card, it's very analog. You have your name, address, Social Security number, date of birth. All that information is being transacted as part of the transaction. With Bitcoin, it's one address to one address. You're not transacting the information, so the merchant is not responsible for warehousing, and safeguarding all this data. And finally, it's an inclusive banking system. There are about, I think the last estimate was about 6.5 billion people in the world that don't have access to what we would call routine banking, deposit banking, savings accounts. They're outside of the financial system. And in fact, a quarter of this country of adults are not in the traditional financial system. With Bitcoin, all you need is a smartphone. Which brings us to government regulation. Anytime there's a disruption, there's government regulation. And that's where we come in. So a little bit about the government regulation landscape right now. It's kind of an alphabet soup of agencies sort of coming together saying, how should we regulate this? Who's responsible for what piece? And so they're like lions fighting over the carcass right now. Like, who gets to regulate what part? But what has surfaced is AML, anti-money laundering. In particular, an agency known as FinCEN, which is part of the Treasury Department, and they enforce anti-money laundering regulations. That's where we come in. So to talk about BitAML and what we do, as I said before, as an entrepreneur, problem, solution, right? We identify a problem, we identify a solution. So what problems did I see? Well, the first one right off the bat was extremely strong regulatory burden, which as entrepreneurs we love, right? That's why we get into business, strong regulations. Well, no, my clients are very upset about the regulatory burden and the complicated regulations, and that's where we come into play to be able to help them with that. And unfortunately, there's limited folks currently in this space right now providing these sort of compliance services. The reason for that is probably, as you know, again, financial services is a pretty conservative space. So you're not going to see a lot of people go into what they view as sort of high risk by going to the digital currency world. Also, compliance is so strong right now in banking that analysts and folks like myself and my peers formerly in that industry, they can basically name their own price. So why would they take that risk, in their minds, their risk, in moving over to the digital currency side? And finally, one of the problems I see in this area, a lot of analog compliance solutions. So basically, what I've seen, people like me that come from traditional banking, they sort of just put on their backpack of all their ideas, and they just sort of go, oh, I'm going to go over here to digital currency and sort of unpack my services. And I've discovered it doesn't work that way. It's a lot like Walmart saying, all right, we have great stores here in the United States, we're just going to go to China and set up shop there. You can't do that. Different customer base, different culture. And I'll show you how I embrace that. The way that you do that is you disrupt the compliance industry. So it was not enough for Joe to participate in an already disruptive environment. I had to disrupt my own environment on top of that. And I'll show you how I did that. First way to do that is an out-of-the-box compliance solution, turnkey solution. My clients come to me, and prospective clients come to me, what do I need to do? I don't want the government to shut me down. How do I stay in business? Best solution? Give them a turnkey solution. And finally, putting together a monthly subscription-based support system. So currently in the world of compliance, you basically have on one end, you have a handful of lawyers that provide sort of one-off services, right, to help get smaller merchants up and running, so people that accept Western Union at a corner store perhaps. Lawyers kind of help them get started. On the other end, way opposite other end, you have in-house compliance folks and lawyers with banks. there was no middle ground because there's never been any innovation or growth in banking. So what I said is, well, my clients are starting up. Regulations will keep changing. They're going to grow. They're going to change their business model. They need to have that support as they go through the process. They don't want one lawyer to drop off a document and leave. And they certainly can't afford to have an in-house service. So I said, again, got to know my audience. How do you disrupt that? You provide support system. So the turnkey compliance program, I mentioned that. So again, designed to meet baseline requirements, nothing more, nothing less. What I tell my clients is these adhere to what are known as the 4 pillars of anti-money laundering to get them up and running and get them started on the right foot, right? So what do they need to adhere? They don't need to bring in people. They need to have the proper documentation. They need to have the proper program ready to go. And it's supported by, you'll see here, product name. So I'm a true entrepreneur. I'm still in the naming phase of developing my subscription-based product. So a little tongue-in-cheek there, but we're supporting that by our subscription-based program. And again, it's compliance as a solution. Never been thought of before. I'm currently pursuing a patent for that because I think by getting a utility patent, it'll really secure my opportunity to accelerate that technology and have a platform where people can come online, make their appointment based on the hours that they want to talk about their compliance needs as things arise. Again, something never thought of in the compliance space. Pretty simple, flat monthly rate, no retainer, no contract. So basically for under $5,000, my startup clients, for a year's worth, four hours a month, for less than $5,000 per year, they can have that compliance support. There's no way any lawyer would take that on for that length of time and for that small amount of money. So I found that my niche right there. And finally, as I mentioned, open office hours, and that includes anything from questions. My client sees something in the media. Hey, what does this mean? Is this rule change? Does that apply to me? Do I need to get this license? Or something as granular as I had a customer approach me. Here was the scenario. How would you handle it? What do I need to do to report it to the government? So kind of grainy here. This was made, obviously, for my website, but this kind of give you an idea of the subscription-based model. The way I like to think of it as sort of LegalZoom and Dollar Shave Club had a baby, and that's what it would be, right? So you have the compliance services, but that sort of sleek, just really straightforward, here's what you get. And of course, the biggest tier here, or the biggest part of these tiers right here, is that hourly interaction with our experts that they can then do on demand as they see fit. So that was a lot to go through. I tried to do it as best as I could, keep it under 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it's been. But the best part for me is to take questions from the audience. So before I do that, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
When you say anti-money laundering,
Yes.
are you simply including in that phrase income tax evasion?
That could be a predicate crime to anti-money laundering. So I guess I'll back up and talk about what
Could you repeat the question back to us who couldn't hear it, or to the video watchers?
Oh, I apologize. So the question, it sounded like, does anti-money laundering include tax evasion? Is that accurate? Okay. Yeah, so no problem. So when we talk about anti-money laundering, so banks and financial institutions are required to have an anti-money laundering program under the Bank Secrecy Act, and that was bolstered by the Patriot Act about all the information they need to have on hand, all the systems and controls and procedures they need to have in place to thwart money laundering, annual reviews of their program. So what you're asking about is actually what we consider a predicate crime for money laundering. So banks are responsible to report suspicious activity to the government, and that would be one such instance. Is that?
I'm still confused
Okay.
because the phrase money laundering usually we associate with some major crime going on. But of course the IRS is very concerned about even the average person on the street
Right.
evading income tax. And it looks like maybe through this system, people would attempt to just simply hide some of their income.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So
I'm
the
trying to figure out what is it exactly you're targeting? I mean, I'm trying to understand your phrase, your use of the phrase.
So it's required that financial institutions, including banks, have an anti-money laundering program, and that's why we're in existence, because it's a regulatory requirement. As to the IRS, a clarification about the IRS looking at tax evasion, the IRS has said Bitcoin is property, and it will be taxed as such. So I don't know if that maybe helps parse out that piece of the equation for you. But again, the anti-money laundering comes in because it's a requirement. That's why banks have it.
So the system has to report that this individual with this social security number had this much money coming to them. Is that what happens?
Yes, so what you're probably talking about is the suspicious activity report, or what's called a SAR. So anytime there's suspicious activity or unusual activity, the banks have a duty to report that to the government, to an agency known as FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They are a bureau within the Treasury. And they take these suspicious activity reports, or SARs, and they hand them out to law enforcement. And so if there's any suspicious activity, banks have to report that. And if they don't, well, we've seen how serious trouble they can get into in terms of fines and other regulatory, other regulatory enforcement actions.
So I'm trying to ask, are all transactions reported to the IRS, or only some that really look strange?
So there are certain things that have to be reported to the IRS. So you have suspicious activity. You also have to report any cash transactions over $10,000. So we've probably seen that in the movie, right? So $10,000 comes into the bank. They have to fill out the form. People will start to do what's called structuring to get around that, and they'll deposit $9,999. Well, guess what? That's going to end up in a SAR because the government says that's suspicious behavior. Yes?
So, as a prospective subscriber, am I subscribing to a team of lawyers that I can consult with that'll kind of help me with regulatory compliance issues?
Not lawyers, but BSA, well, maybe some of them might be lawyers depending on the hiring process that they go through. But basically what I'm getting are BSA, AML, so anti-money laundering experts, people that have worked for banks, they understand the regulations, they understand the nuances, and they certainly have been before regulators before, so they know exactly what's required. So they can answer situational-based questions as almost like an investigator sitting next to you, giving you a different opinion, but they also have that ability to interpret regulatory guidance and answer compliance-related questions. Yes, in the middle of the back.
Can you talk a little bit about your clients and is there a particular industry that you're focusing on, and how are they using Bitcoin in their business, and what percentage of their money are they doing transactions with Bitcoin? Can you just talk a little bit about the people that you're...
Sure. My typical customer base is one of three. Bitcoin ATM machines, or what are called BTMs. So those you can exchange cash for Bitcoin or vice versa, one way or two way, depending on how the terminal is set up. That's my most common customer, just because it's an easier industry to get into, or easier part of the industry, I should say, to get into, because you can buy a terminal for less than $1,000, all the way on up to like $6,000, depending on what bells and whistles you want to have. So that's my most common customer. I already have arbitrage trader customers, so customers that come in and try to trade based on the value, and they buy Bitcoin at a certain price, they try to sell it for a large amount of profit, and they try to leverage the sort of the liquidity and the fluid movement of the currency, because being that there's not that much in circulation, it's going to go up and down. They have to provide an AML program because a lot of the community platforms on which they trade are requiring them to have a platform, or excuse me, requiring them, in order to participate in the platform, requiring them to have an AML program. And the last group is exchanges. So an exchange is just basically like a currency exchange, right? We've all seen them at the airport. Someone comes in and says, hey, I have $100. I need to get the euro because I'm visiting Europe, something like that. So those operate all online. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about how many of these exchanges exist, and just in these BTMs, are they, how many of those do exist? Are they around Peoria?
There are not any in Peoria that I know of. There are several in Chicago, actually several different operators in Chicago. Red Leaf Chicago is one of them, and I believe the other one's called Midwest, or Midwest Chicago. I know there's at least two up there. They typically are in cosmopolitan areas, high traffic, student or tech focused areas. There's a lot in Atlanta, and obviously a lot in Silicon Valley. That should probably be no surprise right there. But the closest we get here would probably be either St. Louis or Chicago. As far as exchanges, I'd say there's hundreds. I think there's some really big players out there like Coinbase and BitInstant that are sort of at the top, and then you have some smaller exchanges down the bottom that are just sort of trying to put together a different business model that appeals maybe to a more pedestrian or a smaller audience base. Yes?
So you talked about the 92% digital currency at the very beginning of your presentation.
Yes.
So what's the percentage of that 92% that is Bitcoin? Like how far is it penetrated in?
Bitcoin is a very small percent. I don't even think it's close to 0.5% of the money that's out there. It's very, very small.
And what do you project the future to be, and what's either be what's the bottleneck or the breakthrough that may come in the future?
As far as breaking through, it's going to be merchant adoption. It's going to be people that are interested in having Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin, and not just holding it, because we tend to get the picture of, oh, it's risky because people are trying to speculate on it. No, it's going to be people transacting with it, people using it as a means of commerce. So you can send money to anyone, anywhere in the world with 0 transaction fees. And if you try to go through Western Union, 6, 7 days, and you have to trust all these different actors in a centralized system that you have no reason to trust and probably shouldn't trust for that matter. And oh, by the way, 20 to 25% of that is just gone, and it's not going to reach its destination.
Maybe a follow-up is what's the tipping point at which you can say, oh, Bitcoin is here to stay? Like, what's the penetration? Like, does it need to get to 10% or 3%, or is it already there?
I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I really don't. I just think that as more and more merchants adopt it, so we have Overstock.com, Sacramento Kings, Airbnb, Playboy, Virgin Galactic, so all these bigger name merchants, Tiger Global, that start accepting it and becomes more and more mainstream. I think that's where it sort of reaches that tipping point. And I think people have to get more comfortable with it. What I'm looking at it right now is I see it as kind of the internet before Netscape. Like it's still a little clunky, the technology. Yes, you can get the transactions there instantaneously. That part is down. But how do we make it a little bit more consumer friendly? And a lot of my clients are working on that, and it's pretty exciting. Yes, in the back.
The price of Bitcoin's dropped like 50% the past year. Don't you think consumers will find that volatility scary and they might not want to invest their money in it? Or?
I think they will, but I think there's a misperception, right? So the price is immaterial. It's just a relative marker to the dollar, right? It's the underlying technology is here to stay, the blockchain technology. Why would you use a centralized authority to verify a transaction when you can instantaneously send it peer-to-peer? And I think investing, unfortunately, people looking at it as an investment because they see a dollar and that's how they can follow things. But rather than look under the hood and say, what is the technology? How does this work? They look at it and say, oh, it's fallen down. Oh, it's dead. It's not doing well. No, that's immaterial. And I think if you're investing and that's your sole strategy with Bitcoin, you're probably not going to do well, just as you would have trouble investing or speculating on currency.
Can you talk generally about, somebody adopting Bitcoin? How do you go from, I never heard about Bitcoin to I want to get involved with it and begin adopting it? Talk through that process a little bit.
Sure. You can go online to, I'd probably start with BitPay. They're probably the largest player down in Atlanta, Georgia. They help with the merchant adoption process. And what they do is they find out what API or whatever software tool you're using as an e-commerce merchant. So for example, PayPal, and they have like 30 or 40 different ones that they can partner with, that they will hook their system up to that payment and instantaneously exchange that Bitcoin for $1. So within 5 minutes, you don't even know if that money in your account came from Bitcoin or came from someone paying with a credit card. They instantaneously change it, so it avoids what I'm hearing out here, some concern about the liquidity and the pricing going up and down. And they set it up, and they have a very high threshold before they start charging money for that conversion. Yes?
Follow-up question.
Sure.
So if, let's say we're taking PayPal.
Okay.
And we adopt Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Do we lose the benefit of using Bitcoin when PayPal zaps us for 3% or 2.5% or whatever it is?
So, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Well, one of the benefits of Bitcoin is peer-to-peer transactions.
Yes.
No fee.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I have to use a Visa or a PayPal or somebody that charges that fee, am I losing the benefit of?
Oh, okay, yeah. So the interaction between PayPal and the merchant system through BitPay. No, so what happens is when you pay the Bitcoin, they convert it and they put that money into your PayPal account. They don't wait for you to
take. It's not a transaction, it's just a deposit.
Correct, correct. They find that place to put it. So they partner with, or they have a way in which they can hook up through the software to, again, I'm not a tech person, they can hook up to your PayPal account. And again, it goes through by clicking accepting Bitcoin, and you put your wallet address or you hold up your QR code. Yes?
I guess I'm struggling a lot with the whole Bitcoin concept as far as competition-wise.
Okay.
I've never had a customer walk in the door and say, do you accept Bitcoin?
Right.
looking at competition, it seems like as they continue to struggle with a lot of the compliance issues and everything, existing competition is already coming up with solutions to what Bitcoin is saying they solve. You know, my wife can go to Starbucks and wave her phone and pay for something.
Right.
No transaction fees or anything. With the new smart chip credit cards that are being issued, we're being forced to upgrade our equipment in our store to accept these smart cards, which will alleviate a lot of the security issues with the existing swipe type of cards. And also, it seems like with Bitcoin, it's almost like a foreign currency. When you're looking at the conversion, you're kind of dependent on what the existing conversion rate is. Who's setting that conversion rate as far as if I go from a Bitcoin to a dollar? Because I assume these BTM machines in Chicago or St. Louis, whatever, but they charge a transaction fee for, if I have a hard dollar Bitcoin and I go to exchange it to a dollar, they're not going to do it for free. They're going to charge me a service fee.
Right, they're going to do a fee, and they're going to put in a little bit of a cushion because of, the, as you said, the volatility going back and forth. And it comes out typically below what an ATM will charge. So ATM fees could be like $3, $4, $5, even for $20. So you do the math, you can see the percentage difference.
But an ATM is taken out of my account, and it's a service fee
Right.
for my dollar. But where Bitcoin is a conversion, I just can't use that Bitcoin and go to somebody else who may not be accepting Bitcoin. At some point, I have to convert that to a dollar.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I think that's the current system that we're living in right now, right? So I don't think the dollar is going anywhere. It's just another means of transacting commerce. I think what you were asking earlier about swiping the card, well, yeah, as a consumer, you're not paying any fee, but the merchant's paying the fee. And that may be okay for Starbucks, but for a lot of us as entrepreneurs and startups, that 2.7%, that 2.9%, that's a lot. You know, especially when you're in industries with very thin margins.
It's argumentative because actually the consumer is, because I'm building that cost in my cost of my goods and services.
Exactly. So as a small business, now you're charging even more.
But I guess I'm trying to figure out, okay, why should I even accept Bitcoin? You know, I can do peer-to-peer through PayPal now.
That's technically not peer-to-peer because it goes through a centralized authority.
What's that?
It goes through a centralized authority, so PayPal is not technically peer-to-peer. It has to go through a clearinghouse.
Centralized place too for conversion, for processing. If I'm doing electronically, somebody's got to act as a clearinghouse.
With PayPal or with
Bitcoin.
There's no clearinghouse. The transaction is verified on the blockchain by miners, and they're rewarded in Bitcoin. That's why it's free. What's that?
So I just have a clarification point.
Sure.
Not really a question. So people look at the dollar as currency, but they don't look at Bitcoin as currency. They're looking at it as a commodity, and that's why people are converting Bitcoin to dollars. Concentrating on that. It's like owning gold or silver, right? It's like you're looking at how it compares to the dollar, whereas what Bitcoin is trying to do is become the currency. So as you know, as more people, as more merchants adopt it, meaning they accept Bitcoin for transactions, more people will use it directly as currency, rather than trying to focus on how many dollars I can get from one Bitcoin. So, like, let's say I was running a business and I was accepting Bitcoin. If I were transacting directly with Bitcoin, then I would have no fees. But if I'm just trying to get $1 out of that transaction, there would be fees converting that Bitcoin to $1. So, I mean, if I can buy as a small business all of my overhead supplies, if I could pay my payroll in Bitcoin, if I could pay directly my costs with Bitcoin, then I can accept Bitcoin directly and then just manage my business that way.
Okay, but who's then regulating the value of that Bitcoin? Because if I'm dealing in Bitcoin,
The free market.
I've got
Market.
Exactly. Well, what the free market has already shown with Bitcoin, you've got serious fraud in Bitcoin. You know, there have been.
What? There's fraud in Bitcoin? Where?
You haven't heard about the fraud in Bitcoin?
What are you talking about?
The individuals that were issuing the Bitcoins and that were hoarding the Bitcoins and Bitcoin values.
Bitcoin is issued based on an algorithm over time.
And who develops that value? The merchants or the issuers?
Who develops the value? The value is what people are willing to pay for it. Yeah, it's very scary because we're not talking about the central banks anymore. It's an actual pure free market, or about as pure as you can get. Yes?
Okay, I'll apologize in advance for this mind-bending question.
No problem. Mind-bending questions are great.
Do you see this as part of the movement towards one world government, or do you see it as championing the rights of individuals, or could it ironically be both simultaneously?
So the question was a little bit about Bitcoin in sort of the political sense. Do we see it as sort of a one world solution or something that could be inclusive? I don't know. I don't try not to get involved in the politics of things. I think what we're seeing, again, with a greater decentralization of services and of goods, I think we're finally seeing that the central banking model does not work. Printing money for the welfare warfare state doesn't work. But what does work is when you have decentralized way of doing things, a self-contained ecosystem where we know there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoins ever put into circulation. They can't be printed, they can't be duplicated. There are 21 million and then divisible by a fraction, 8 decimal points.
Who decides?
Who decides? It's already written into it's an open source program, so you can go on and see it right now.
No, who decides if there's to be 21 million Bitcoins?
That's the way it was created. The algorithm was created that way, and that's it.
Okay,
So you have consensus on the network. If you had to have changed one thing with Bitcoin, every single person on the network had to agree. I mean, we can't get half the room to agree on a topping for pizza. So I don't know how you're going to get every single, person on this network, to agree to a change. Yes.
I think the analogy to open source software is a good one. Maybe you can use that as a way of explaining Bitcoin and why it's like open source software. And maybe even giving a little bit of background on open source of what that is. Because I think to some of us it's a newer concept.
Yeah, so open source software, I agree with you. And the question was circling around how can we better present this maybe and package it up by focusing on the open source aspect. Just generally speaking, Bitcoin itself is open source, right? So I mentioned before that the code is open source, the transaction ledger, everything is open source. Anyone can go home and download it and see every single transaction going back to the first issuance of Bitcoin. And I think having that openness and everybody being able to see what's going on, instead of having these private ledgers, I mean, that's a key aspect. We're talking about transparency. And it's kind of interesting and ironic that the media tries to portray this as this sort of system where everybody's anonymous and you can't see anything. And meanwhile, there's a public ledger that says every single transaction, and the government can't have it two ways. They can't say, oh, this is anonymous, but yet they're able to go after the Silk Road mastermind by tracing transactions on the blockchain.
Maybe it's just to add to it. If you look at Linux as kind of a software program that's open source, how has it evolved? Where you have a variety of people who basically submit changes to the open code, and people there are ways that basically the code gets agreed upon before it gets applied to the whole network. Does that analogy also apply to Bitcoin? Is there? I don't know if there's any changes that need to occur, or is it just static transactions and that's the only thing that's ever posted that's open?
Yeah, I think the Linux analogy is perfect. Basically, Bitcoin is a consensus-based network. Any change would need to be approved by everybody on the network, and that nothing is impossible, but that's pretty darn close. I mean, how do you get everybody on that network to agree to some sort of change? Any adding of more currency is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, because everybody on that network would have to agree. Now, there are other coins coming out there besides Bitcoin that offer other different metrics in terms of how long it's going to take to issue them, how they're mined, and maybe what they stand for, whether that's social or political movements. There's fish coin, gay coin, pot coin. There's something for everyone out there. All these different coins, Apple Byte for artists. All these different coins that have some sort of political or social meaning behind them that have different metrics on how they're released. But again, they're using that same open source code. So that, again, that's a great way of looking at it. Yes?
So if somebody wanted to open up or start using Bitcoins, do they open, is it just like an email address opens it, or do they have to go to a Bitcoin bank? And if it's, I guess second part of that, this sort of open source registry of every transaction, like what's the sort of privacy issues around, like do people want to have everything they transact on an open ledger?
Okay, so a couple questions there. I heard one about how do I get started in Bitcoin, what do I need to get rolling on that, and then the other about sort of privacy on the public ledger. To start off, you would download a wallet, it's free, and you get a wallet, and that's where you'll store your Bitcoin. And then you can go to, as I mentioned, ATM, or BTM, Bitcoin teller machines, and purchase it that way. You can also go through places like Local Bitcoins. There are traders actually in Peoria, And in Bloomington, we'd be happy to meet you at a location and make that arrangement to sell it to you in a sort of open public forum. So that's a great way to get into it right there. There are also things called Bitcoin faucets, where just as it sounds, you open the faucet and you can fill up with Bitcoin. It's typically in very small denominations, and these websites are supported by advertisers and the like. What their goal right there is just to get you familiar with it, to be able to play around with it. Very small value, very fractional value, and you can send it to your buddies, or you can donate it, as most transactions of Bitcoin are given to charity, which is pretty cool. So I think that's powerful right there. The second half of your question, you asked about privacy in the blockchain. All you're sending on the blockchain is what address it's going from and what address it's going to. There's no information going with it. There's no name, there's no social security number. I mentioned the target data breach before. You don't have to worry about that as a merchant, because all you're getting is that money going to your business. And the blockchain will be able to show the addresses. And using old-fashioned police activities, if law enforcement is so inclined, they could actually trace those transactions and ultimately trace them until they reach, reach some sort of subpoenable, some sort of entity that they can subpoena, because an exchange is actually a business with an incorporation or LLC. So there are ways to trace those transactions, but at the same time have that privacy of the transaction, so that everybody doesn't know, your private business, again, your name, social, and things like that. Wow, no more questions? We all have all of our Bitcoin questions answered. Yes?
What can the people in this room do to help you with your business?
What can they do to help my business? Merchant adoption is key. Education is even bigger. So if you can go out and familiarize yourself with Bitcoin, watch some videos. Some recommendations I'd make are Andreas Antonopoulos. He does a fantastic job of explaining Bitcoin. He's a serial entrepreneur, and he's become sort of the spokesperson, if I can say that. Bitcoin doesn't have a CEO or a Fed chair or anything like that, but he's kind of become the sort of evangelist for the space. And he just breaks it down in simple terms, despite being a tech person by trade. So again, research is a big one. Exploring merchant adoption, going to businesses like BitPay that do that conversion for merchants. See how it works. Very slick, straightforward website. Shows you what you need to already have in place for e-commerce, how they partner together, how they can convert it like that. Again, education is kind of the biggest hurdle right now, and I get a lot of that feedback. I've never gotten so many, I don't want to say hate mail, but criticisms by email or LinkedIn or anything like that of people saying this is a Ponzi scheme, this is tulip mania, both of which are impossible to be based on the way the system is. And people not really looking at the total value of the underlying technology. The fact that we don't need central authorities anymore, right? So I'm not here to make a political statement, but I think we're seeing it in the marketplace that there's a repudiation of centralized authorities. Uber is crushing and will crush the taxi industry, right? So we're seeing that with the financial services. Why would you pay all this money for an arcane system that's paying rent in Midtown Manhattan using 1970s servers? Why would you be paying for all that when you can have a self-contained ecosystem that is so transparent? I got a little excited there, I apologize. But looks like we have another question in the front. Yes, sir?
So to clarify, what is discoverable, the only thing discoverable, the only traceable, are two IP addresses?
Not IP addresses, what would be your Bitcoin wallet address. So it's a series of like 20 or 30 numbers and letters, capitalized, lowercase, in order. So again, that kind of comes into how can we make it more consumer friendly. That's your Bitcoin wallet address.
And that address is stored where?
Not stored anyway. There's no sort of clearinghouse to store it. When it comes into play is when you do a transaction on the blockchain, because you're basically putting yourself out there and saying, hey, I'm transacting $5 worth of Bitcoin and I'm sending it to you. But otherwise, you hold on to your wallet address. Nobody needs to know it. You can put it on the internet. So people that sell services put out their Bitcoin wallet address, and so they'll put it on their website and they'll say, hey, send me money. So there was a guy that was at I think it was ESPN College Game Day, and he held up a sign that says, send me Bitcoin. He put up his QR code and his address. He got over $20,000 or $30,000? People just sending him nickels and dimes or a couple bucks. And he was able to do that just by holding up a sign, because you put it out there. None of us would share bank accounts with each other unless there was some sort of commerce going on in this room. We'd have no reason to do that, and we'd be worried about identity theft. With this, people put it all over the internet. Hey, send me money. The worst you can do is send someone money, right? You can't steal anything from that. In the back.
Well, this sounds awesome. Let's say I want to sign up today. I want to go Bitcoin. Woohoo! Right? Or even the next, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to be, we don't have the, we want to have those transactions and everything. What is the likelihoods for us to get some customers paying in Bitcoins? Can we be paid in Bitcoin or can they pay us in dollars? I mean, you see what I mean? At the end of the day today, can we make the move to be Bitcoin ready and then be actually making business with Bitcoin to be our currency?
Yeah, getting Bitcoin ready is pretty easy. As I mentioned, you get a wallet and then you hook yourself up with like a BitPay that can convert that to dollars just because that's the way the system is right now. The best opportunity are for, especially for online businesses, because you're going to get a lot of press because it's still kind of a novelty and you can kind of leverage that. So if you saw when the United Way started accepting Bitcoin, they got a lot of press. Obviously their namesake helped as well. But anytime a new merchant comes on board, that just goes viral all over the internet, especially within the Bitcoin community. And you're opening yourselves up to a great audience. Typically they're upper middle class, they're tech focused, and they're millennials, right? So who wouldn't want that as part of their demographic? Great, people that like to spend money and they're young and they're hip. Cool, bring them on board. Those are the people that you're going to immediately resonate with. And I think that as the technology evolves, more and more people will come on board. CoinDesk, it's an online media source for Bitcoin news. They do an annual survey and they come out and they show all the different metrics of merchant adoption, customer base, and they show you what you'd be getting into relative to transacting commerce, and as well kind of a bigger picture of where the ecosystem is going. So I invite you to kind of look up and see if you can find their annual report.
Okay, well thank you,
All
Joe.
right. Well, thank you.
Real quick, I forgot to mention, we're coming into Q3, so if anybody's interested in sponsorship, please see Randa and myself or Tori. And if you haven't filled out one of these nice little cards, please do so. You only have to do it once. We're going to be sending out emails, so you can expect that will say something along the lines of who the presenter will be for the next week. So they'll be up by the fishbowl. And drink the coffee and eat the bagels that Mike brought, please.
Thanks for the bagels. Yeah.